Were you listening when Mark read the passage? Just in case you were distracted, we're going to read it one more time. Now the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, "See, the place where we dwell under your charge is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, and each of us get there a log, and let us make a place for us to dwell there." And he answered, "Go." Then one of them said, "Be pleased to go with your servants." And he answered, "I will go." So he went with them. And when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But as one was felling a log, his axe head fell into the water, and he cried out, "Alas, my master, it was borrowed." Then the man of God said, "Where did it fall?" When he showed him the place, he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. And he said, "Take it up." So he reached out his hand and took it. What is that? For the last couple of years, I kind of made it a practice to teach a Mother's Day-esque kind of sermon, loosely based on motherhood. And I had every intention of doing that, but I was very distracted this week when I read this text again. I'd read it before, but I got to thinking, what is the point of this text? I mean, at one level, we can say, all right, well, it's showing us God's power, God's supernatural power in this case, that's working through the prophet Elisha to provide for God's people. Nothing wrong with that at all. But it seems so trivial. It seems so unnecessary. It seems completely random that there's this miracle in smack dab in the middle of Kings. What substantial teaching, if any, can come from these 7 verses? Now, because the story is so strange, people have really struggled to explain what it means. And they've offered some very inventive interpretations, which I think go off the rails. I want to share a couple of them with you. We could, first of all, just rationalize this. What really happened, we might say, is that Elisha just took a stick and he really poked around in the bottom of the water until he got the stick kind of hooked in the axe head and he drug it to the surface and they pulled it to the shore where the man could retrieve it. We could rationalize it. But the problem with that approach is that's not what the words say in the text, right? We can't have that interpretation. It won't allow us. Or we could criticize it. We could, instead of rationalize it, criticize it, where scholars will furrow their brows and they'll claim, well, you see, this story is just a legend. This event was just blown out of proportion by Elisha's admirers and his disciples. Later generations just invented this miracle. Now, the problem with this approach is, while some people make this critique, they don't supply any evidence whatsoever to support it. So again, doesn't seem to be a fair reading. Or, you might not rationalize it or criticize it. You might take this text and allegorize it. You know what allegory is? That's when people make a text say something it doesn't say. That's when overexcited people read their ideas into a text that aren't there. For example, and I am lifting this straight from a commentary. This is someone who is respected in the academic world and all this. Well, the axe head is our soul. And it's sinking in sin. And the Jordan are really the rivers of God's judgment. The stick is made of wood. Therefore, the stick must represent the cross of Jesus, which lifts us up to salvation. But faith is needed. Therefore, verse 5, you need to be like this man to reach out and take it. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is that's not the way we generally read stuff. You know, if Rachel said to go to the grocery store and she gave me a grocery list, and it said noodles on the list, I wouldn't say, noodles. Well, Rachel sometimes says, use your noodle. And a noodle then is your head, so obviously she wants a head of lettuce. You don't read things like that. You don't allegorize things unless the text warrants it, and this one doesn't seem to be doing that. So, some people have tried to moralize this text, meaning you're turning this story into a kind of Aesop's fable. It's like a morality tale. It's a rebuke against borrowing other people's tools, which there might be something there, but I don't think this text says it. It could be a proverb. Never cut wood near a body of water. Or it might be an argument against deforestation or urban development or something like that. I think we're all smart enough to realize that those aren't really fair interpretations of this text. What does a straight reading of the text give us? So here are 4 things that I learned from this text this week and want to share with you. Number 1 is that I think it shows God's concern for a simple need. What's the problem in the text? The problem in the text is this guy lost his tool, right? Don't think too hard about it. His axe head flew off, freak accident, lands in the water, sinks to the bottom. It's a big problem. It's a simple need. It's an individual need. Now, how do you determine the significance of that? Well, anytime you're looking in the Bible for the significance or the meaning of a text, it's always good to put it in its context. What comes before this story? What comes after this story? And that kind of helps you see the meaning of the text that you're reading. Well, let's ask that question. What comes before? Well, we won't read it, but if you look in chapter 5, you'll notice that chapter 5 tells us the story of Naaman. Naaman was a Syrian general, and he had his own problem of leprosy. And he was told that there was a prophet in Israel who could cure his skin disease. And so he asked the Syrian king to give him leave to go to Israel and seek out this prophet. The Syrian king gives him a letter. So Naaman is this general of an army, and he's walking through Israel. He's got this letter in his hand that's explaining this whole situation. He gives it to the king of Israel. The king of Israel says, yeah, right. This is all just a ruse. You know, you're trying to foment war. This is not what you're really here for. So he misinterprets it. So Naaman's leprosy is an individual need, but I want you to see in chapter 5 it had huge political ramifications, right? He thought that this was going to start a war between Syria and Israel. Well, that's what comes before. Look at what comes after. Look at chapters 6 and 7. Just scan through there, and you'll see that it tells of a number of military battles between Syria and Israel. The fears were realized. There was all these fights. And in fact, in chapter 7, Syria besieges Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. So we ask the question again to our text, what does this have to do with some guy losing an axe head in a river? And I think the response to that is exactly. Yes. In the middle of these scenes of international politics, of foreign affairs, of military strategy and national crisis, this text shows us God is concerned about this one guy who loses his tool. Here's the point, I guess. What does this have to do with us now? Well, we live in a big, complex world with big, complex problems. There's chaos in the Middle East. There's the threat of international terrorism. There's increasing violence and division on U.S. soil. There's economic instability. This inflation is out of control. There's political unrest. We could go on and on and on. And in the midst of this global turmoil, how can God care about the details of our relatively insignificant life? We might say, isn't God's agenda already full with these big problems? Why would he be concerned about me and my little problems? Part of God's greatness is that in the midst of the big, complex problems, God is still concerned about the small, simple problems. And I think this text is testifying to that. That basic truth that Jesus said to his followers, one who is faithful over a very little is also faithful in much. And here God is being faithful in a little thing. I think we make a big mistake when we associate God's greatness only with bigness, with fireworks. Just because you and me get flustered when we're presented with big, complex problems, and we can't be bothered then with all the piddly little details, doesn't mean that God is too preoccupied, that God gets distracted, that God is pressured by deadlines. It's like we're making God into this graven image, this CEO type God, where he can only see the big picture. And that's not the God of the Bible. The God that we serve is great, and part of his greatness is that he does attend to the comparatively small, mundane problems of his people. And so we would say the hairs on your head are numbered. The axe head in this case matters. What's the practical value? Listen to Peter. Cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Yes, heaven is his throne and the earth is his footstool, Isaiah 66. But your problems, no matter how small, still concern him. Don't be afraid to give him your burdens, no matter how small they are. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is God's power for a genuine need. This wasn't just a simple need, although it was, but it was genuine. What's the problem with this guy losing this axe head? Well, the problem is it wasn't even his. Alas, master, it was borrowed, right? So this shows us, it gives us a little bit of insight into the kind of financial situation of these sons of the prophets. Kind of a strange group. We don't know very much about them. They were traveling around with Elisha, perhaps learning from him, worshiping together. We don't know much about them, but this at least shows us the kind of dire straits they were in. They were very poor. This man didn't even own an axe. Hence his despair when he sees it flying off into the water and splashing into the Jordan. Meals and tools and pennies could not be taken for granted. Iron tools would have been relatively expensive at this time. Losing it meant real financial distress. And I think our knee-jerk reaction, at least when I read this story, I said, big deal, go get another one. Go buy one, right? To which this guy would probably say, with what? Where would I go? It's not like there's a Lowe's or there's an Ace Hardware or something I can go get one. No, this meant he would have to pay a lot of money for it, or he'd have to go mine the ore himself, refine it, go through chop down the wood for the fire and do all the business, right, of making this axe head. This is the Iron Age, 1200 BC. There's no Ace Hardware, right? He doesn't have cash in his pocket. It would be, to put it in our terms today, it would be like someone who was in poverty, wrecking their friend's borrowed car, right? It would be very difficult. So this miracle wasn't some unnecessary, miraculous gimmick, right? God doesn't do miracles just for the fun of it, right? There's a genuine need here, and God is providing for that, albeit in a very mighty, miraculous way. So what does this mean for us? Well, let's not get carried away. It doesn't mean that God is going to provide for us always in a mighty way or in a miraculous way. Nor does it mean that if you drop your car keys in a sewer grate or in a body of water, that God is going to make them float up to you, right? Rather, we're just making the general point that we serve a God who can be trusted to provide for our needs. That's what I see here. One way or the other, God is going to provide for our genuine needs. I'm reminded of Psalm 37. In Psalm 37, the psalmist is telling us not to fret over the evildoer. We have a tendency to look out into the world and see these other people. They're not even serving God, and they've got it made. Look at their life, you know? They don't seem to be having any problems. And David says, no. You need to look with eyes of faith. These people are in trouble. Don't fret over the evildoer. But I like what he says here in the middle of the psalm. Psalm 37, verses 25 and 26. He says, I have been young and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken or his children begging for bread. He is ever lending generously, and his children become a blessing. There's the testimony of an old man. God takes care of his people. Now we need God's wisdom to make clear what our genuine needs are. I think one problem we have in a consumer culture in Western, society is that we have a tendency to overinflate the definition of need to cover way too much ground, right? When the Bible talks about needs, it's talking about needs. What do you need? You need bread, you need food, you need clothing, you need shelter. Jesus speaks about this in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. And he teaches us not to be anxious about such things. People, the pagans, they wear themselves out with worry. But he says your body is more than clothing. Life is more than food. He says to look to nature, to see God's care for lesser creatures, birds and flowers. We're much more valuable to God than birds and flowers. So doesn't it follow that God would care for us? He would also provide for us. So our Heavenly Father knows we need these things. And therefore, Matthew 6, verse 33, Jesus says, seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So I don't know your situation, but maybe you're overly concerned, you're anxious, you're worried sick over having your needs met. And what Jesus would say to you, what He is saying to you through this text, Matthew 6, is serve God. Make God the priority of your life, and just watch how things will begin to fall into place. Let's look at the third thing here. God's supply for a future need. So we can trust God to provide what is genuinely needed, and we can know that God is at work in the details. Here we're talking about something we talked about last week, which is providence. And that's God's fascinating way of working out things for the ultimate good of His people. And I think I'll be conservative here, we may see it in this text. And it might not be obvious. Elisha's presence at the river turns out to be crucial, right? And why is Elisha even at the river? Because the guy asked him to be there. Remember the guy? He says, hey, can we go over there and we can cut down some trees and build ourselves houses? And he said, go. And then verse 3, the servant said, be pleased to go with your servants. And Elisha said that he would go. So cheers to the guy who spoke up, right? Or else this axe head would be lost. And there's no way that Elisha or this man who asked him to come could have guessed what would have happened at the river. I mean, the axe head flying off the handle was a freak accident. There's no way they could have known about it. So what I'm saying is this could be an instance where God quietly arranged circumstances before they knew they needed Him. The request of the man for Elisha to come and Elisha's consent seems kind of trivial in verses 3 and 4, But in verse 5, 6, and 7, it turns out to be crucial for solving this problem that was in the future and that was unknown. So again, just to be conservative, we don't know that for a fact, but providence is a tricky thing to pin down. We're not always sure in our situation how God is at work in the details in any given moment. But to recapitulate last week, we know, Romans 8:28, we do know that God is at work in all things for the ultimate good of those who love Him. So I love knowing that about God because it makes life a lot easier. And I don't have to worry about a lot of things, right? It adds a lot of hope to know that God is working in our lives. It adds comfort that He's going to provide. It gives us courage to go out there and live for God and not to be afraid. And just kind of an added bonus, I feel like, of being a Christian. Isn't it exciting to know that you're part of this great story? That there is a God who is in control and that you're His servant and you in some way might be working in His kingdom to bring about some good in someone else's life? So who knows what God might be up to in your daily routine? Who knows how He could be using us? So our response to the knowledge of God's providence should not only drive us to worship Him and adore Him because of His power and His wisdom, but also to view ourselves as instruments of His will. So don't be surprised when God opens a door. You got to be ready to walk through it. Well, let's look at the last thing here, and God's appeal to a spiritual need. What is the main point of this story? Well, here's just something to consider here. The book of Kings. We know that the book of Kings wasn't completed until after Judah was taken into captivity in Babylon. How do we know that? Well, because the book itself, chapters 24 and 25, record that event happening. Therefore, the writing had to be after that. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that the original audience of 1st and 2nd Kings would have been those exiles in Babylon. And we might ask, how would those exiles in Babylon be reading this little passage 300 years or so after Elisha was gone? This is also a miracle story, and so it can be grouped with the series of miracles done in 2 Kings chapter 4, which all show, as we began, in one way or another, God delivering and helping His suffering people. So let's bring it all home. What does that mean? I want you to imagine that you're an Israelite and foreign invaders came into your town and put chains on your wrist, you and your family, burned down your house, you got nothing but the clothes on your back, and they ship you off to Babylon. Now you're one of God's chosen covenant people. God has made special promises to you because you're an Israelite, but you don't feel very special right now. You're enslaved to a foreign power. You're without a land. You're without a home. Your temple is burned to the ground, and you might be questioning your faith. Does God really care? So could we not understand these miracle stories, and this one among them, chapter 6, verses 1 to 7, as God's appeal to these captives who lost their way? God's appeal saying, put your trust in me. Look what I do for my people. That's what these stories, these miracle stories, all seem to be saying. Listen, here is the God who's available to you. See how the mighty arm of the Lord works for those who fear Him. See how near He is to the brokenhearted. See His compassion and His love that's poured out on the poor and needy. Turn to Him and seek His mercy. And we might even draw that into our own time. Couldn't these stories be functioning in the same way for us? That each person here has his or her own version of desperation and need. And we each have our trials. And these stories appeal to our hearts and our minds to seek the God who gives grace and help to those who are in need. Do you guys know who Stonewall Jackson is? You should know who Stonewall Jackson is. Well, before he was Stonewall Jackson, he was just regular old Thomas Jonathan Jackson. And in one day, this man's world caved in. His infant son had been stillborn. And that night, his wife died of a hemorrhage. One day. And he wrote this letter to his sister Laura. And his sister Laura was not a Christian, did not have faith. Listen to what he says to her. My dearest Ellie breathed her last on Sunday evening, the same day on which the child was born dead. Oh, the consolations of religion! I can willingly submit to anything if God strengthens me. Oh, my sister, would that you could have him for your God. Though all nature to me is eclipsed, yet I have joy in knowing that God withholds no good things from them that love and keep his commandments. And I think generally that's the message of these texts. Because there are people reading them who are struggling. Maybe they don't have faith, or maybe their faith is weak. And the text is appealing to them. Would that you could have such a God. Would that you could serve such a God. He is a God who's present. He's a God who is mighty in every kind of emergency, big and small, complex and simple. This story might not look like much, but when you pair it with the other miracles in chapter 4 and you see it, in the bigger picture of Kings, it shows that our God, as the psalmist said, our God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. So how can we end? How can we bring this lesson home? Well, a word of caution and a word of comfort here. Don't despise the small things. This text isn't exactly a big compendium of theology, and it's not one of those Romans 8, kind of texts. But don't despise little stories like these in your Bible reading. Sometimes they're exactly what we need because they reveal other facets of God's beauty and strength and worthiness. Think of Jesus. Jesus never despised the little things, didn't he? Or the little people and their seemingly little problems. Now, what does the prophet Isaiah say about the Messiah? He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break. You know what a reed is? You could just pick one of those. They're not even a dime a dozen, right? There's millions of them out there. Grow near water. This is what was held up to Jesus to give him that cup as he suffered on the cross. It's nothing, right? And they bend very easily. And guess what? When you bend a reed, what do? You go out and get another one. A bruised reed Jesus will not break. A faintly burning wick he will not quench. He's not going to snuff it out. No, he'll give it new life, new flame, new warmth. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He does not despise the little things. Neither should we. Right? And a word of comfort, knowing and believing that God cares about the little things in our life. I think that is what sustains us through the tough times. It's only a matter of time. This is a young congregation. But one of the drawbacks of that is we don't get to hang out with old people. Old people are great to hang out with because they've been through some stuff. They've been through tragedy. They've seen heartache. They've seen loss. And I bet they would tell you God sustaining them through the little problems helps them when something really big happens. helps them get through. If God is faithful in a very little, then he is also faithful in very much. If God is faithful to provide for our lesser earthly needs, food, clothing, shelter, then surely he can be trusted to provide for our greater, eternal, spiritual needs, mercy, grace, salvation. And how has he made those available? Only in Jesus Christ. This is what Jesus has to say. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. God has made his appeal to us in person by coming in Jesus. And he wants us to appeal to him through confessing his Son Jesus, through being baptized for the remission of our sins, and living a life of faithfulness to him. If you need to respond to the gospel, then Christ invites you. Let's stand and sing.